winter of 1987 pressed down heavy on the Appalachian ridges, turning the mountains into jagged walls of white silence. A storm had swept through the night before, leaving the roads crusted in ice and the branches sagging with the weight of frozen snow. The world seemed locked in suspension, every sound muffled by drifts that swallowed the forest floor. The only noise that broke the stillness was the crunch of boots, 3 sets pushing steadily along a narrow, unpaved road that wound through the hollow like a vein carved into the earth. The air burned with every breath, sharp and metallic, carrying the faint odor of smoke from some distant hearth. To the left, black pines rose like sentinels, their trunks dark and narrow, stretching upward into a sky the color of slate. To the right, a creek cut through the hollow, frozen at its edges, water moving sluggishly beneath a skin of ice. The men and woman moved in silence, their faces red with cold, collars turned up high. At the front was Sheriff Henry Colson, a man whose gray mustache caught flecks of frost. He had lived his entire life in these mountains and knew their moods, their dangers, and their secrets. Behind him walked Rachel Denning, a county social worker, her scarf wound tight around her face, her gloved hands gripping a worn satchel that carried official papers. Last was David Harrow, a reporter from Charleston, brought in after a string of anonymous calls had landed on his desk. "There's a family up there," the voices had whispered. "Something ain't right. Folks won't talk, but you should see for yourself." Their destination was a cabin said to belong to the McCurdys, a name that surfaced only in fragments, and muttered warnings passed along in gas stations or half-empty diners. No one ever said it loud. It was as though the mountains themselves did not want the name carried on the wind. As the trail steepened, the snow thickened, sucking at their boots until each step felt like dragging lead. Colson paused near a bend, gesturing toward the ridge. Through the thinning of the trees, a structure revealed itself. The cabin looked less like a home and more like the skeleton of one. Its boards leaned with the years, patched with scraps of tin and mismatched wood. Smoke leaked weakly from a crooked chimney, thin and uncertain, as though reluctant to admit life inside. The front porch sagged under its own weight, its railings broken in places, with what looked like an old child's rocking chair tipped on its side. David pulled his camera from his pack, careful not to slip on the ice. "Doesn't look like anyone should be living here," he murmured. Colson didn't answer. His eyes, stern and weathered, stayed fixed on the cabin. Rachel shifted uneasily, pulling her coat tighter. "We're sure they'll let us in?" she asked. Her voice muffled through the wool. The sheriff gave no reassurance, only a grunt as he started forward again. The 3 mounted the final rise and stepped onto the clearing where the cabin crouched like an animal ready to retreat into the woods. The air here was different, heavier, damp with the scent of unwashed earth and smoke. Somewhere beyond the trees, a dog barked, high-pitched and strained, then went silent. Colson raised a gloved hand and rapped his knuckles on the door. The sound echoed hollow against the weathered wood, sharp in the winter air. For a moment there was nothing, only the creak of the trees under the weight of snow. Then, faintly, came a scuffle from within, followed by a low sound. It was not words, not even a voice, exactly. More like a drawn-out moan, thick and garbled, as if someone were trying to speak through water. Rachel's hand tightened on her satchel. The reporter lowered his camera, eyes narrowing. Another sound followed. Closer, this time a shuffle of feet dragging across the floorboards, then a higher-pitched whimper, almost childlike but broken, as though the syllables had been twisted out of shape. Colson knocked again, louder. "Sheriff's office," he called, his voice carrying the authority of decades. "We need to speak with you." Inside. Silence stretched, suffocating in its length. Then something scraped against the wood just on the other side of the door. Deliberate, like nails or fingertips trailing across the planks. David scribbled quickly in his notebook, the ink freezing at its tip. He looked at Rachel, who had gone pale, her breath fogging in nervous bursts. The sheriff's jaw tightened. He knocked a third time, each strike like a gunshot in the still air. "Open up." From within, a chorus of sounds answered, not speech, not language, but a blend of groans, mutters, and uneven laughter. It rose and fell in disjointed rhythm. Too many voices at once, colliding in a way that made the hair at the nape of Rachel's neck lift. The sound was human, and yet it wasn't. Coulson set his hand on the latch. For a heartbeat, all three stood frozen, listening. The cabin exhaled warmth through its cracks, carrying a rank odor-damp straw, grease, and something else, sour and heavy. David swallowed hard. Rachel's eyes glistened, caught between fear and resolve. The sheriff pushed down on the latch, and the door creaked, just enough for the cold light of day to slip inside. And then they heard it again from deep within the cabin, something that no one could mistake for words. But that carried the weight of an answer. A voice, human and not human at once. They had come seeking a family, but what echoed back from behind that door made them question if what lived there could still be called one. The name McCurdy had not always carried fear. Once, in the fading light of the 19th century, it was simply another among the hundreds of families carving out a place in the Appalachian Mountains. They arrived with little an ox cart, a handful of tools, a Bible, and built their first shelter in the shadow of the ridges. The land was poor, but it was theirs, and in those hills they swore they would never again be beholden to anyone. But independence in these mountains came at a cost. The hollow where they settled was cut off by cliffs on one side and a twisting creek on the other, passable only by mule trails that froze solid each winter. What began as separation hardened into isolation. By the time the first McCurdys' children grew, there were no easy roads back to town, and no need to return. The few neighbors who braved the distance in those early years described the McCurdys as quiet, suspicious, and fiercely private. They sold pelts and jars of moonshine when they needed cash, but rarely lingered at markets. Whispers said they believed the outside world had brought them only loss and betrayal, and that the mountains were their shield. Over time, those whispers turned to warnings. By the turn of the 20th century, townsfolk had noticed something troubling the McCurdys rarely married beyond their own kin. At first, it was excused travel was hard. Outsiders distrusted them, and the family was large enough to keep its numbers steady. But as decades passed, a pattern emerged. Cousin married cousin, uncle took niece, and children were born who bore the same pale eyes, the same narrow jaws, the same stammering tongues. The family claimed it was to keep the blood pure, a phrase that slipped into local legend, passed down with a shudder in the telling. The hollow grew inward-looking, ruled by unspoken laws. Strangers were unwelcome. Girls were kept close, rarely seen beyond the cabin porches. Men carried rifles not only for hunting but for warding off the curious. And most of all, no one was to speak of what went on inside the hollow. If a child strayed into school, they were withdrawn within days. If sickness spread, no doctor was summoned. They survived as their ancestors had, clinging to rituals and remedies that belonged to another century. For decades, county officials pretended not to see. The McCurdys paid no taxes, filed no deeds, and existed in the margins of the law. They were spoken of in the same breath as superstition, like ghosts in the ridges. Real enough to frighten children, but distant enough to ignore. A farmer might tell you he once sold corn liquor to a McCurdy boy with a twisted spine. Or a midwife might whisper of delivering a baby who never opened its eyes. But these stories stayed on porches, exchanged in hushed tones, as though naming them too loudly might draw the hollow's gaze. Rachel Denning had read these stories in old case files, thin folders tucked into the county archive, notes scribbled by social workers long retired home not fit for habitation, refused entry at gunpoint, children unaccounted for. Each line was a dead end, stamped with words like inconclusive or case closed. She found herself staring at the names Mary, James, Elsie, wondering what had become of them. Had they lived to adulthood? Had they escaped the hollow, or had they vanished into it? One generation folding into the next like branches twisted inward. David Harrow's research led him further back. In the archives of a small-town paper from 1931, he discovered a brief article local men arrested for illicit distilling. 4 of the McCurdy clan taken in raid. Beneath it, a grainy photograph showed 4 figures, faces blurred by age and poor ink. What caught David was not the crime, but the expressions. All 4 stared at the camera with the same vacant eyes, lids heavy, mouths slack, as if the lens had captured something not fully awake. The sheriff, for his part, had never needed files to know the name. As a boy, Henry Colson had heard older men in town use it as a warning. Stay out of the ridges, or you'll end up with the McCurdys. Hunters claimed they had heard cries in the night, too wild to be speech and too human to be animal. Others said they'd glimpsed figures moving through the trees, pale against the bark, watching but never approaching. By the mid-century, the clan's land was nearly impenetrable. Roads mapped on paper led nowhere, petering out into thickets. Their fields were small, stunted, but enough to keep them alive: corn, beans, the occasional hog. What they lacked in harvest, they made up for with barter pelts, liquor, handmade tools. Outsiders accepted the trades and did not ask questions. It was easier that way. And so the McCurdys endured, generation upon generation, bound by silence and suspicion. They had become less a family than a shadowed legend, a story told to frighten children into staying close to home. Yet legends have roots, and those roots were sunk deep in the soil of that hollow, fed by choices made long before any of the living had been born. By the time the 20th century waned, the McCurdys had all but disappeared from official record. Their births went unregistered, their deaths unmarked, their very existence known only by rumor and the occasional uneasy sighting. In town, the name had become shorthand for something beyond understanding. When people said the McCurdys, they no longer meant individuals. They meant a warning. And warnings, when ignored, have a way of demanding attention. For the sheriff, the social worker, and the reporter standing on that cabin porch in 1987, the knock on the door was not just an inquiry, it was the first challenge to a century-old silence that had kept the McCurdys hidden from the world. The knock on that weathered cabin door was only the beginning. What followed, in the weeks that stretched into months, was less an investigation than an unraveling thread by thread of a secret the mountains had guarded too long. David Harrow began with the neighbors, though finding anyone willing to speak proved harder than prying the frozen creek open in January. In the small town 10 miles downhill, most would only glance away when the McCurdy name was spoken. In the diner, one old man finally broke the silence. His hands shook as he nursed a cup of black coffee, voice low as if the walls themselves might be listening. "I heard 'em," he said. "Nights when the fog hangs low. You catch sounds carryin' off them ridges. Not words, more like wailin'. Sometimes laughin', sometimes cryin'. Makes your skin crawl, 'cause you can't tell if it's human or not." Another neighbor recalled a figure he'd seen once while hunting deer. skin pale as birch bark. He murmured, eyes not looking at me so much as through me. I dropped my rifle, near forgot where I was standing. Never went back up that way. Rachel dug deeper into official records, though they were thin and scattered. She uncovered school attendance logs from the 1940s. One name, Daniel McCurdy, appeared in the register for only 2 weeks. The teacher who had written the entry was still alive, now in her 80s, her memory softened by time but sharpened by what she had seen. He was a boy, she recalled, eyes glassy. 8 years old, maybe. Quiet, wouldn't speak unless pressed. When he did, it was slow, broken, like the words got stuck before leaving his mouth. He'd stare at the other children as if they were creatures he couldn't understand. Then, one morning, he just didn't come back. His seat stayed empty till the year's end. Rachel's search led her to medical files locked away in the county office. The folders were thin, some little more than a scrap of paper with a name and half-finished notes. But together they told a story. Words repeated themselves across the decade's congenital defect: cleft palate, malnourished, nonverbal, scoliosis, low cognitive function. Cases were marked closed not because they were resolved, but because families had refused entry, or because no follow-up could be made without deputies. A single doctor's report from 1957 stood out. It described an infant delivered under duress. The doctor, escorted by armed men who refused him entry into the main cabin. He wrote the child was alive at birth but presented with severe facial abnormalities. I was denied further examination. The family insisted on handling matters their way. When I attempted to return, I was threatened with a firearm. David, combing through courthouse archives, unearthed something stranger still. A deputy's diary from 1939 hidden among old evidence boxes contained entries written during a prohibition raid. The man described stumbling into the McCurdy Hollow at dusk. I cannot rightly describe what I saw. Shapes moving among the trees, pale and bent, like the bones of men that had learned to walk. They made sounds, Lord, help me, not words, but groans and mutters. A chorus that set my teeth on edge. I told myself they were drunk from the still, but in truth, I do not believe that was it. As the weeks wore on, the sheriff found himself pulled between duty and dread. He had seen enough to know the rumors were not just mountain gossip. But how to proceed? The law was built for men who lived within it, those who paid taxes, signed deeds, carried licenses. The McCurdys lived outside that framework. To intervene meant trespassing on a world the county had ignored for nearly a century. Yet the pressure grew. Anonymous calls continued, some frantic, some pleading. A woman's voice crackled through one line, trembling. There's children up there. They ain't right. Somebody's gotta do something. Rachel visited the town's oldest midwife, who spoke in a whisper as she closed the curtains. She admitted to having delivered several McCurdy infants decades earlier. Some came stillborn, she said. Some lived, but not like other babies. Their eyes wandered, their limbs bent strange. The mothers wouldn't cry. They just accepted it, like that was the way of things. David, relentless, documented it all, quotations, faded records, photographs of old articles yellowed with age. In his notes he wrote a single line, circled twice, this is not neglect. This is a system. The picture was forming, dark and undeniable. Generations of isolation had twisted bloodlines until the very traits of the family were written on their bodies, carved into their bones. But worse than the deformities was the silence the way the community had conspired, by fear or by apathy, to let the McCurdys vanish into their hollow, unchallenged. One evening, Rachel spread the documents across her kitchen table, papers fluttering in the draft from the old stove. She traced the names with her fingertip. Theo, Elsie, Mary, James ghosts on paper. Children who had grown and disappeared into the hollow shadow. "They're not myths," she whispered. "They're people." Sheriff Coulson sat across from her, his broad shoulders hunched. He stared at the files but spoke not to the paper, but to the silence that hung between them. "If we don't go back," he said, "it won't matter how many records you keep. No one will believe it. Not until they see." The decision was made, though none of them spoke it outright. They would return to the hollow. They would see for themselves what the McCurdys had become. What they would find behind that cabin door was not rumor, not record, not legend, but the undeniable evidence of a bloodline turned inward too long. The morning they returned to the hollow was bitterly cold, the kind of chill that seeps into marrow and lingers there. Snow still clung to the shadowed slopes, though a weak sun had begun to thaw the upper ridges. Sheriff Coulson led the way, a folded paper tucked inside his coat, the warrant that gave them legal grounds to enter. But in his gut, he knew paper meant little against what waited behind that door. Rachel carried no satchel this time, only a notebook and a resolve stiffened by sleepless nights. David trailed behind, camera slung around his neck, tape recorder humming softly in his pocket. He had covered coal mine collapses, strikes, even murders. But nothing had left him so restless as the hollow, as if the ridges themselves whispered warnings he could not shake. The cabin stood unchanged, sagging and silent, smoke curling faintly from its crooked chimney. Yet, as they approached, the air shifted, heavy with a stench that made David press a sleeve to his face. It was a mixture of damp straw, cooked meat gone sour, and the faint ammonia of waste left unwashed. Coulson knocked, his knuckles striking hard. Silence stretched. Then a shuffle of feet answered, closer this time, heavier. He called out, "Sheriff's office, we've come with authority to enter." The door creaked, but it was not opened. Instead, a chorus of noises seeped through the gaps, groans, murmurs, the high-pitched squeal of something caught between laughter and pain. He pushed. The door gave way. The first wave was smell-thick and choking, a suffocating cloud that clung to skin and fabric. Inside, light slanted through broken shutters, illuminating a single room that served as kitchen, bedroom, and parlor. Straw mats lay scattered across the floor. A rusted stove smoldered faintly in the corner, its pipe crooked toward the ceiling. And then there were the people. A dozen forms occupied the dim space, their pale faces turning slowly toward the intrusion. Children sat clustered on the floor, their eyes wide, their limbs thin and twisted in ways that looked painful even at rest. One boy's hands had fused into mitten-like shapes, fingers webbed by thick skin. A girl, perhaps 12, rocked back and forth, her jaw slack, a stream of drool glistening in the low light. On a wooden bench, an older woman swayed, her gray hair tangled, eyes cloudy but unblinking. She murmured a tune, wordless and repetitive, her body moving as though bound to an invisible rhythm. In the far corner, a man with shoulders hunched and spine curved into a sharp bend stared silently, his mouth working but producing no words. Rachel froze. Her breath caught, chest rising and falling too fast. She had read the reports, seen the faded notes, but nothing could have prepared her for the living reality. David's camera clicked, the sound loud in the cramped air. Through his lens, the details sharpened the blue of a boy's irises, startlingly bright against his pallor, the raw sores on another's arms, the resemblance that threaded every face, binding them together like copies of a single mold. "Dear God," he whispered. A child crawled forward, legs dragging weakly behind him, and reached toward Coulson's boot. His hand was small but twisted, nails thick and yellowed. He looked up, mouth open, a sound emerging that was not quite a word but carried intention all the same. Rachel crouched instinctively, her eyes wet. "It's okay," she whispered, though she knew the words were meaningless. The child pressed something into her hand, a photograph, its edges cracked and curling. In the faded image, a family posed stiffly before the same cabin decades earlier. Their clothes were patched but clean, their postures proud. Faces clear, eyes bright, features ordinary. No deformities, no vacant stares. Just a family, untouched then by the years of isolation that would come. Rachel swallowed, her throat tight. The photograph shook in her hand. They were normal. She breathed. Coulson's jaw clenched. Not anymore. From the far side of the room, a low voice broke the murmur of sounds. It came from a man perhaps in his 40s, his features less distorted than the others. His words were halting. Each syllable dragged into shape. Blood must stay. No, outsiders. His gaze fixed on Coulson, unblinking. Pure, keep pure. The phrase struck like a hammer. It was no accident, no misunderstanding. The generations of inbreeding were not merely survival, but doctrine. A creed whispered and repeated until it became truth. David's tape recorder captured the words, its reels spinning. The sound of superstition turned into confession. Evidence inked not only on their bodies, but on their tongues. Rachel shook her head, tears streaking her face. They've never known a world beyond this ridge. Never been given a choice. The sheriff stared at the photograph, then at the room of faces staring back. He saw not just deformity, but history, the weight of a century pressing down. Choices made in fear calcifying into law. For a long moment, the cabin held its breath, and the intruders and the family caught in an uneasy stillness. Then the rocking woman began her song again, her voice breaking, high and thin, carrying no words but filling the air like a lament. David lowered his camera. "This will end the silence," he muttered. But in his voice there was no triumph, only sorrow. Rachel closed her notebook without writing. She did not need ink to remember what she had seen. As they stepped back into the cold, Coulson glanced once more inside. The children still sat huddled, eyes vacant but watching. The photograph burned in Rachel's pocket, and behind them, the chorus of voices rose again, not words. Not quite, but the echo of a family caught in its own design. The warrant had given them the right to enter, but what they carried back out the photograph, the voices, the undeniable proof would ignite a fire far beyond the hollow. A fire that could not be contained by mountains or silence. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge that day, the hollow no longer belonged only to whispers. The sheriff, the social worker, and the reporter had carried something out of that cabin more powerful than any warrant could sanction proof. And proof, once seen, could not be unseen. News traveled fast, even here. Within weeks, David's articles began appearing in the Charleston paper, each installment more detailed than the last. Photographs showed the sagging cabin, the faces of children blurred by ethics, but unmistakable in their vacancy. His words walked a careful line, clinical in their detail, but heavy with a sorrow that made readers shift uneasily in their chairs. "This is not myth, not rumor," he wrote. "This is a family left to collapse inward, hidden in plain sight by our refusal to see." The reaction was immediate. Some readers demanded intervention, calling for federal aid, medical rescue, foster care. Others recoiled in disgust, painting the McCurdys as less than human, creatures rather than kin. The line between pity and revulsion blurred in the public mind, leaving the family stranded in the same gray place they had always occupied, feared, pitied, but never understood. Authorities debated what to do. The sheriff filed reports, but legal precedent was thin. The McCurdys had no birth certificates, no property deeds, no record of existence beyond the notes Rachel had pieced together. Without guardianship papers, the county struggled to claim jurisdiction. Removing children required legal parents to surrender them, but here, parentage was tangled beyond recognition. A few attempts were made. 2 of the youngest children were taken into foster care, carried from the hollow by deputies who spoke afterward of the silence that followed them out the way the rest of the family had simply stared, unresisting, as if watching parts of themselves being cut away. The foster homes tried, but the children bore scars deeper than bone. One could not speak beyond fragments. The other cried whenever left alone in a room, his voice echoing the same word over and over, home, home, home. Rachel fought for more. She wrote letters, stood at county meetings, begged for rural outreach funds that might bring teachers and doctors into the ridges. For a brief season, it seemed her voice might carry. A church group donated supplies. A clinic sent volunteers. But as months passed, the attention faded. The public's hunger for tragedy waned, replaced by fresher headlines. The hollow grew quiet again. Sheriff Colson retired soon after, citing health reasons. But those who knew him said it was not his body that had failed. It was the weight of memory. He was seen sometimes in town, staring at the mountains with an expression as gray as the ridges themselves. You can't enforce law on people who live outside it, he muttered once. But that doesn't mean you forget what you saw. For David, the story made his career. His series won regional awards, cited in journals, debated in classrooms. Yet, in interviews, he spoke less of triumph than of unease. The photographs show what's there, he said, but they don't capture the silence. The silence is worse than the deformities. He carried the faded photograph the child had handed them, tucked into his desk drawer. He never published it. Some truths, he believed, cut too deep for public consumption. Medical researchers seized on the McCurdys as a case study in genetic isolation. Papers were written, diagrams drawn, DNA theories spun. They spoke of recessive traits, of mutation, of the price of a closed gene pool. To science, the family became data points, examples cited at conferences far removed from the hollow's dirt floors and broken shutters. But in the town nearest the ridge, the legend endured in another form. Parents warned their children not to wander too far, not to stray into the trees when fog rolled low. The mountain folk will hear you, they said. They'll follow your voice. Hunters claimed to glimpse pale figures on the timberline, eyes glinting in the dark. The hollow, once hidden, became myth again, this time sharpened by truth. By the early 2000s, few McCurdys remained. Some died, unmarked, their bodies buried in shallow graves along the creek. Others simply vanished, slipping deeper into the ridges until even their kin lost track. The cabin itself collapsed in a storm, its boards rotting into the ground. Only the chimney stood, a crooked monument to what had been. Yet the story refused to fade. It lingered in whispered warnings, in old files tucked into county drawers, in the photograph Rachel kept sealed in an envelope long after she retired. And it lingered in the minds of those who had stepped inside that cabin, who had seen faces that mirrored each other too closely, who had heard voices that struggled to be human yet clung stubbornly to life. In the end, the McCurdys were neither monsters nor mysteries. They were the consequence of choices compounded by silence, by a family's fear of outsiders, by a community's willingness to look away, by a system that found it easier to forget than to intervene. The mountains had trapped them, but so had indifference. And now their story sits with us, demanding a question we cannot answer easily: was this neglect, or survival at any cost? And if you had been the one to knock on that cabin door, and to hear the voices that answered, what would you have done?